Hello, everyone, and welcome to our seventh lecture in our African American history class. And this week, we will, this week, I'm sure you just watched the other one we have for this week too. So this time, we'll say, right? We're continuing to kind of build upon this story, right? This is paradox, right? That sits at the heart of the United States of America between freedom and enslavement, right? Like how does the nation deal with this, right? How is it that the nation comes to finally resolve this issue, right? And for those of you who, took history in high school and stuff, I think we know how they resolve it, right? And sorry, there are ambulances rushing by. I think we know how they resolve it. And it is not an easy resolution, right? It's not like everybody comes together, sings kumbaya, right? And, agrees that, hey, we'll just work something out, right? This is indeed not what happens. We get to the Civil War, right? And what we're trying to do here is kind of set up the Civil War, right? Like, how do we get to this conflict, right? How does it come to this conflict? And last time we talked about kind of the leftover problems, right? The leftover issues surrounding enslavement that weren't solved by the Constitution, right? That maybe some people wanted to solve it. Maybe some people thought they could do something about this. But at the end of the day, right? Just pragmatically, people could not figure out how to, get the South to sign off on this federal government if they pressed the issue of enslavement. And we'll go ahead and we'll take a look at how they dealt with that, right? So, what's the next step, right? Now that we do have a nation that has a federal government, how do we get, right, to the point where they can finally do something about this enslavement issue, right? So let's go ahead and get started, right? So this class, we're going to ask, how did the United States deal with the paradox of freedom and enslavement, right? They're not compatible, right? If you want to be the land of the free, right? It's kind of hard to argue that you are when so many people are enslaved, right? How did the United States deal with the political disagreements between the nation and individual states, right? The fact that maybe the nation as a whole desired something, right? But part of that, legacy of getting the South to ratify the Constitution, right, meant that the South at least believed, right, that like the federal government didn't have any right to tell them what happened in their states, right? How did these differences nearly tear the United States apart, right? How did they become so contentious, right? That it created maybe one of the largest problems, and probably not maybe, like really one of the largest problems our nation has ever faced, right? And could these disagreements ever be solved peacefully, right? Or was it just always destined to become violent, right? These are what we're kind of taking a look at here. We got our boy Thomas Jefferson here, right? Who argued that, enslavement would be dealt with in time, right? That, it took time. And maybe he's right in some ways and maybe he's wrong in others. So we'll check it out. We'll see what we think, right? Okay. So the anxieties of enslavement, as we've spoken about before, many Americans were very aware, right, of the contradictions between its vision that all men are created equal, right, and the fact that a large portion of the nation practiced enslavement, right? They understood the paradox of it. They understood that it was like kind of weird, right? And many of these critiques would come from the northern part of the country, in which enslavement wasn't imagined to be an integral part of the economy, right? The North really didn't have a reason to defend enslavement, right? And on top of that, there are also people, observing the United States, right? From outside, right? Um, Famously, Alexis de Tocqueville, who was a Frenchman, wrote one of the great kind of depictions of the United States, in which he kind of stared at it from outside and said, I don't belong to this new nation, but I'm interested to see how it works. And Alexis de Tocqueville kind of pointed out what he would call the peculiar institution of enslavement, right? He calls out that like this is weird, right? Like it's weird that you can go around and meet all these people who talk about freedom. You talk about freedom and liberty and all these things, right? Yet it's like this dark secret, right? Or maybe not really a secret, like everybody knows about it, but like, oh, let's not talk about that, right? That kind of rests at the heart of American society, right? So this is a kind of weird image, right, that Americans have adopted for themselves, right? So the North and South, right? Disagreements regarding slavery were not easy to resolve, given the significant power that individual states retained to administer their own territories, right? Remember, we talked about that. So many states, especially southern states, right, were afraid that the creation of the federal government would mean that they now had a new boss who could tell them how their states were going to run. And of course, they weren't going to ratify the Constitution if this is the way it was going to work. So the Federalists were kind of obligated to tell these Southern states, like, hey, don't worry, you're going to be able to, you know, administer your own state, right? Like, we're not going to come in and tell you what to do, right? And so this is kind of what they were led to believe in the South, right? Regardless of the ideological contradictions brought forth by many Northerners, right? Southern states just argued that abolishing slavery would devastate their economies and livelihoods. It's all they had ever really known since colonial times, right? How could they make money if they had to pay people, right? And that's kind of bullshit. That's kind of wrong, right? But in the same sense, like they weren't ready to give it up, right? Hey, do you have a better solution for us? And I don't really think that people could argue that it was going to be a happy transition, and therefore the South didn't want to go along with it, right? And this meant that from independence until the middle of the 19th century, politicians kind of learned how to avoid volatile talks about enslavement, right? Nobody was moving on the issue, right? You could bring it up, but the South wasn't going to hear it, right? And in that sense, why bring it up? Why you needed to get other things done, like in the nation, right? You needed to work together as a nation. So why bring up this thing that's just going to divide us amongst each other, right? And I don't know. It's a very weird kind of balance to strike when you think about it for the new United States of America, right? So contradictions and compromise, right? The largest issue complicating this kind of tenuous agreement, right? Hey, let's not talk about it, right? The largest complication, right, was the fact that the United States was growing, right? In 1803, the French Emperor Napoleon had significant concerns in Europe. He was waging war across the entire European continent, right? And had decided to, kind of offload the French colonies in North America, right? Napoleon, the French had aided, right, the Americans in the American Revolution, and there was a close relationship that developed between these two nations, right? And Napoleon, kind of imagining that he had bigger fish to fry, right, kind of went to the American government and said, "Hey, do you want to just buy French colonies in the Americas? Because we're not really that concerned with them anymore. It's not, maybe we don't have great plans for the Americas. We have other things to do, right?" And of course, this was agreed to, right? And this is what the Americans bought, the Louisiana Purchase, right? Louisiana Purchase significantly expanded the territory of the United States, right? And of course, all of the people that lived in the United States on the East Coast were more than happy, right, to kind of envision themselves maybe pursuing lands inside this Louisiana Purchase, right? You can make money out there. Who knows what you could find, right? Some people, maybe they just want to be left alone, right? There's all kinds of reasons why Americans would now go like, well, hell, let's kind of move into this territory and, take advantage of it and see what we can find there, right? And of course, we know that this would end up creating new states, right? The process of expanding the United States and creating new states was pretty straightforward, right? U.S. territories that had achieved a significant population would petition the federal government to become a new state, right? Hey, we'd like to become a state. This is how you kind of begin to administer, right, this territory, right? And get senators, get representation, all of those things, right? There's a lot of people here. We're all, more than happy to become a kind of functional member of the United States, right? And after meeting certain congressional criteria, and displaying a majority of your populace desire this to become a state, right? Admission would be granted. Hey, no big deal, right? This is, of course, how nations grow, right? It's not really that controversial. Hey, there's a new state. We'll give them senators, we'll give them representatives, and there we go. We have another one to add to the union, right? Um, Now, it is complicated though. And it's kind of this enslavement that makes it complicated, right? As we've spoken about before, the federal government took care to balance the power that each state had in the federal government, right? Sorry, that's a little redundant, right? But essentially, um, you know, it's complicated making sure that all of these states have the power that they want, but also not too much power to piss everyone else off, right? It was a huge concern during the first constitutional convention, right? And enslavement was contentious enough that a balance was struck between states that supported enslavement and those that did not, right? Um, and this created something of a stalemate, right? Um, you know, I'm sure people had very strong opinions, pro and anti-slavery, right? But if you can kind of strike a balance, right? Maybe it's, these two sides can coexist, right? So here's the problem then. What happens when a new state comes in, right? What happens when a new state comes in? Uh, are they going to be pro-slavery? Are they going to be anti-slavery? Does that upset the balance, right? Okay, now we're starting to see that expansion was necessary, but it also kind of brought a lot of questions to the table that could become uncomfortable, right? So fears arose on either side of the issue that an imbalance in the number of senators and representatives, too much on one side of the issue of enslavement or the other side, right, would prompt the nation to decide the slavery issue one way or another, right? And this meant that every time a new state petitioned for admittance to the Union, right, fear spread throughout the government that we might have to confront this enslavement issue. And so the plan was simple for American politicians: do everything you can to avoid having to deal with enslavement on a national level. Do everything you can to avoid the problem, right? Because people were worried. People were worried about what would happen when they had to confront the issue. And this is, Missouri and Maine is really one of the first case studies of this. In 1817, settlers in the Louisiana Territory petitioned to join the United States as a state called Missouri, right? And immediately conflicts arose over the federal government's role in deciding the status of enslavement in this new state. Okay. Both sides of the issue felt that the federal government should take a strong stance. Hey, this should be a state that supports enslavement, right? Meanwhile, other people are like, oh, hell no. We can't support enslavement in Missouri. That's not okay, right? And, okay. On the flip side, right, both argued that the federal government would also be tyrannical if it attempted to enforce what their side didn't want, right? You kind of can't win in this situation, right? If the federal government decided that they were going to admit a new slave state, the abolitionist, free state side would say, well, this is bullshit. The federal government supporting enslavement, right? And it's the roles would be completely reversed if they decided to promote it as a free state, right? They just can't get along. There's no way to make this problem go away, right? So what can they do, right? And the issue really was solved by a senator who frankly is a huge influence in a lot of these things. Henry Clay is famous for his compromises, right? Um, and what Henry Clay said is like, hey, look, Missouri can be an enslaved state, and we'll go ahead and make a state out of Maine, right? So it's like we're adding two states. One, Maine won't support enslavement. Maine will be free, and Missouri will be enslaved. So two states will come into the union, and the balance will be retained, right? Woo! Everybody goes, oh, hell yeah, Henry Clay, you're a genius. You're a genius, right? The balance is preserved. Hey, everybody's happy, right? Everybody's happy. Put it to bed. Put it to bed before it kind of spins out of control, right? And this is what Henry Clay is kind of famous for. Essentially, kicking the can down the road, right? We're not going to deal with this. Somebody else has to. We'll leave it to somebody else in the future. But for us, right? For us right now, let's just do something to make sure that this whole thing doesn't blow up in our faces, right? So Missouri, Maine revealed the plan for enslavement, right? Kick the can down the road and avoid the issue entirely. Let the future deal with it, right? Um, but in so many ways, it also, provided some insight into how contentious the slavery issue had become in the United States and within Congress, right? And heads up, not just within, politics, right? But people had feelings about this too. People felt that Missouri coming in as a slave state was bullshit, right? Now, okay, so enslavement was going to stay in the South. We already understand that, but like now we're instituting new territories, new states that will support enslavement after we've liberated ourselves and said all men are created equal. All this stuff, people were not okay with this, right? Meanwhile, Southerners, promoted that, hey, well, this is great, right? It's very contentious, right? And the belief grew after this, and it started to grow more kind of salient, right? That the issue was too contentious to be solved without something disastrous occurring, right? Meaning that they avoided it even more, right? They were even more motivated to ignore the enslavement issue, right? Because it seemed like people were getting really worked up over this, right? On both sides, right? So let's do our best to make sure that we don't, kick the hornet's nest, essentially, right? Now, westward expansion provided a slow and constant pressure on politicians who would have to one day confront the enslavement issue, but other forces were changing American life as well, right? Um, the industry, like industrial growth, right, was changing the nature of American enterprise, especially in the northern states, which adopted industrial forms of production much more readily than in the southern states, right? And we had talked about this last time, right? It's the North that had to kind of innovate, right? That was in all of these things like transportation, right? All of these industries, right? That, they completely saw the benefits of industrial growth. Meanwhile, the South was largely agricultural, and like, sure, yeah, industry can aid, agriculture, in some ways, right? But in many ways, agriculture remained kind of how it had always been, right? And that would change eventually, but at this time, right? I think we can make that distinction, right? The growth of northern industry would slowly kind of start to alter the power dynamics between different regions in the United States, right? Where, during the independence movement, right, you might be able to say that the South was really the cash cow of the United States, the one that was producing all of the crops, right, that everybody wanted. North wasn't too bad, right? Maybe a little bit less lucrative, right? But with the growth of industry, it was clear that the North was actually becoming much more powerful than they were, right, during the independence movement, right? And so this is really altering the power dynamics of the North and the South. Who has the sway? Who has the kind of ability to say, we're contributing all of this to the nation, right? And so, fueled by the cotton growing industries, fueled by cotton growing like in the southern states, right? The North developed early industries like cotton textile factories, right? Kind of following the plans of England, right? And places like Lowell Mills in Massachusetts employed over 8,000 women by 1840, right? As the United States slowly grew into an industrial powerhouse, right? And this is something that became really a mark of progress for the United States, was like how industrially advanced they were becoming, right? A young nation that had really stepped into the future in so many ways, right? Um, and the need for laborers to fuel budding industrial enterprises saw the population of the northern states grow significantly, especially due to immigration, right? All of these industries are popping up, and guess what? They need labor, right? Those are jobs. And so, if you can imagine, if you're somebody who might want to go to the United States, do you want to land in the South or do you want to land in the North, right? I'm sure if your skin color isn't white, you probably don't want to land in the South. I think that's pretty understandable, right? But even if you are white, right? Um, who's going to have the jobs? Who's going to have the opportunities, right? Immigration swelled most significantly in the North as immigrants sought employment, right? Americans and foreigners who intended to find labor to support themselves were both pulled in by the growth of Northern industry, right? And repelled by Southern agricultural economies in which they could not hope to compete with enslaved labor. You can't hope to compete if you won't like to get paid. You're not going to get a job next to an enslaved person, right? It's just not not what those people are going to choose, right? And as a result, the North continued to become a highly populated modern metropolitan area, right? That very much asked for immigrants, wanted immigrants, right? To fuel the need for labor that American industries had, right? And this is where we sit here and we see the Statue of Liberty. This is it's in this period, right? That this was kind of erected, right? Along with this, give me you're tired, you're poor, you're huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door, right? Hey, if you're having trouble anywhere, if you're poor, if you're struggling, come to America where we're growing. We'll give you opportunity, right? We'll take you, right? And of course, where's the Statue of Liberty? Right? Where do we talk about when we think about this moment of profound immigration into the United States? Places like Ellis Island, right, in New York, right? Because Northern industry is what would give people this opportunity. And, you know, the nature of Congress was that there were issues there regarding this Northern growth, right? Growth. Northern politicians, even those differing political parties, right? Whatever side of the aisle you're on, kind of fully intended to spread these industrial enterprises as far as they could, right? Of course, industry is booming, right? We need to spread these things. We need to modernize. We need to kind of expand upon this, and the government needs to support this growth. Most importantly, right? Technocrats, right? People who thought technology was, kind of the way of the future, right? Envision a United States that could be connected via railroad, right, from sea to shining sea, right? A place that could be completely connected by modern amenities, right? Like a railroad, maybe like electricity, maybe all of these things, right? This could be one huge nation and it could be connected, right? By these modern amenities, right? And further enticing these industrial dreams, the United States grew even larger, right, in 1848, unfortunately, at the cost of Mexico. A war with Mexico that ended in 1848 saw the United States take over 50% of Mexico's landmass, right? Heads up, it was a war that the United States started on false pretenses. And it was a war that Mexico couldn't really fight that well, considering they had only become a nation, 20 years earlier, right? Soon after gold was discovered in Alta California, right, or California, what would become the state of California, quickly swelling its population with wealth-seeking Americans. All of a sudden, this, brand new American territory saw an enormous amount of people flooding into the region, right? Because gold had been discovered in 49, right? Which is where we are San Francisco 49ers, right? Everybody rushes in trying to make their fortune, right? I'm going to go to California. I'm going to find me some gold, right? And with the United States fully spanning the continent now, the metallic wealth being discovered out west was quite enticing, right? It also meant that many people suddenly showed up, and that populace could demand statehood, right? And so the fever to connect the nation with railroads grew even more seductive, right? Hey, we got this new place out, west, right, in Alta California, right? They want to become a state. We need to connect them. We need to be able to expand. And how do we get the gold back? How do we take advantage of this, right? We're going to need the railroads. We're going to need to be more connected with the West Coast than ever before now, right? Issues arose, however, when it became clear that California and many of the potential West Coast states were vehemently opposed to enslavement. Something you could be proud of as a Californian from the first instance, right, of this question. California, California was like, hell no, no slavery. That's no, right? And I mean, aside from the moral issues of slavery, the fact that you can say, dude, this is wrong, you shouldn't do this to people. It's wrong, right? Um, I mean, anybody who was worried about what would happen in this new area, would you be able to support yourself? Would you be able to have opportunity? Would of course be afraid that the introduction of enslavement would destroy their economic opportunities in the West, right? And this is like one of the kind of trends that we're going to see, right? Enslavement really benefited rich elites who can afford to buy people, right? And a place like California, discovering gold, it was like an opportunity for all, right? As long as you went out there, you could get lucky. You could strike it rich. You never know, right? But one thing's for sure, if a rich dude shows up with 30 enslaved people, right? You're not going to be very competitive against that enterprise, right? And so, in spite of the fact that it is ethically and morally wrong, right? And many people felt that way, right? The issue is that even if you're just thinking about money, you don't want enslavement in the region, right? And this, of course, very much worried pro slavery advocates in Congress, right? As the nation grew, it was starting to become more difficult to find ways for enslavement to expand, right? it wasn't going well, right? There wasn't a lot of logical reasons why normal white people would want this economic competition from enslavement, right? In spite of the fact that it also was really weird and really seemed wrong, seemed antithetical to what Americans were supposed to want, right? And the only people that seemed to want this thing to expand were, of course, these southern states where people owned enslaved people, right? But nobody was moving on the issue. The southern states weren't willing to compromise on this, right? But it's almost like the free states were starting to outgrow, right, these issues. And that made the southern states even less willing to compromise. It's so complicated. What a mess, right? What a mess that was left over from this kind of constitutional convention, right? And now the Kansas Nebraska Act of 1854 was very important in the way that people would decide new territories, right? It was decided that as part of their admission to statehood, um, the issue of many things, including enslavement, was to be determined by the people that were going to be living in the state, right? So you guys petition for statehood. There's all you people here. Cool. Why don't you let us know what you want? Do you want to be a slave state? Do you want to be a free state? We will respect what it is that you want because, frankly, I think politicians in Congress are like, I don't want to be responsible for what happens, right? I don't want to be. Let them decide. And then we could always say, hey, that's what they wanted, right? It's not us, right? And so I think this gave Congress a little bit of an out, right? And so this is what Kansas, Nebraska in 1854 was supposed to be. Hey, why don't you guys, right, kind of vote? What would you like? Would you like to be a free state or would you like to be an enslaved state, right? And though that seemed pretty simple and it helped the federal government avoid culpability, right? The chaos that followed was not planned for and was quite shocking. What transpired is a thing that we remember now as Bleeding Kansas, right? Political violence spun wildly out of control during this voting period as elements from a pro slavery Missouri spilled across the border, determined to fraudulently vote in support of enslavement, even though they were not part of that territory, right? This was known to, like, hey, who are all these people? They don't live here. They're not part of Kansas, right? And what followed were violent clashes between pro slavery and anti slavery elements in the streets of Kansas, right? With an estimated 48 people being killed in the perpetual violence that followed for weeks, right? And this is, 48 people being killed, but many more were injured, right? Places were burnt down. People rioted and fought in the streets, right? People who were anti enslavement, right? Who felt that this was wrong. And places like Missouri that had slave owners who basically tried to roll across the border to intimidate and outvote, right? Those anti enslavement, members of this Kansas territory, right? And the election ended up being tampered with so openly and badly that no consensus could be determined. Nobody could figure out what people actually wanted because the election was an absolute cluster, right? Meaning that Congress had to intervene, which is kind of exactly what they didn't want to do, but Congress was kind of forced to, right? And now this kind of reveals, right, kind of part of the problem, right? It was determined by Congress that Kansas, if we took the voices of the people who could be confirmed to be living in Kansas, right? It was determined that Kansas desired to become a free state. They did not support enslavement, which is, you know, kind of makes sense, right? Of course, we just talked about this. Like as a person, why would you want to support enslavement if it meant that it advantaged, people who were wealthy and can bring slaves into the territory, right? Um, and so, it was determined, right, that this was the popular sovereignty of this territory. This is what they wanted. They wanted a free state, right? But in order for that to be approved, right, it had to be approved by Congress, right? Congress had to say yay or nay, right? And essentially, President James Buchanan and Congress refused to approve Kansas's desire to become a free state, right? And this is because the South refused to approve it, right? So the Kansas-Nebraska Act was made into law. Was decided, right? And it was determined that what Kansas wanted was to become a free state, right? But with all the mess and the fact that it needed Congress's approval, the states that were pro slavery would not honor their popular sovereignty. They would not sign off on what that territory wanted. And this is where we start to kind of stretch into, the kind of inevitable, insane hypocrisy of this all, right? You said you were okay with them deciding. And so they decided. They decided to become a free state. And it turns out that Southerners in Congress, um, they didn't care what they decided, right? I know we said we'd go with whatever they decided, but no, we can't. We're just not going to sign off on it. And this kind of brings you to a standstill, right? I mean, it kind of shows the face of the issue, right? The Southerners are going to stop anything that they don't see going their way, right? It doesn't matter how many people desire it, how many people want it, right? So this is not good, right? Pro-slavery elements in the government would not honor the popular sovereignty of Kansas, which is kind of bullshit, right? Isn't that what the United States is all about? One more paradox, right, at the heart of this whole thing. But it didn't stop things from changing, right? The opposition of Southern members of Congress bled into other national issues that debilitated the growing United States, right? Northern industrialists agreed that a federal initiative to build a transcontinental railroad was necessary for the growth of commerce in the United States. Southern congressmen, however, refused to support many of these Northern led initiatives. It didn't benefit them. So why would we support it? The argument is that many of the kind of proponents of federal government would say, like, look, it's for the good of the nation. It may not be good for the South right away, right? But this is going to be for the betterment of the entire United States. And essentially, the South was like, well, we don't really care. Like, we're looking out for what we want, right? Which kind of seems like the enslavement issue, too, right? Oh, we don't really care if this is what everyone had decided, right? It's not good for us, so like we're not going to go along with it, right? And those in Congress who correctly determined that the future of the nation lay with industrial growth were consistently kind of stifled by oppositional Southerners, right? Like, what the hell, man? Like, it's not just enslavement, it's that this kind of place is not going along with like what we need to do as a nation, right? And I think that became the kind of consensus, right? That something was going on with the South, right? Something was wrong here. And in some ways, the North was almost like inevitable, right? Like we're sitting here hundreds of years in the future, right? And we can sit here and say, yeah, bro, like we know where things are going. It's going to go to factories and industry and all these things, right? And in many ways, in 1840, right? England, which was the most powerful empire on earth, had already proven that that was the future, right? That industrial enterprise, right, provided the money and the strength, right, to become a truly, kind of transcendently powerful nation, right? And the opposition to these kind of plans of the North that arose from the South almost seem like denying almost like a natural law. Like, why would you stand in the way of something that everybody knows to be for our best interest, right? And due to this industrial growth, right, the North had become far more populous than the South, right? Serving as a destination for any who desired paid work and opportunity, which meant that as the South kind of stood in the way of all of these Northern desires, right? The North could say, like, but we have more people. It's a small number of people, a smaller number of people, right, that are standing in the way of what the greater nation at large wants. Why are we letting this happen? Right? I mean, we have these issues today, right? Despite the violent consequences, it became clear, right, to many that the South was standing in opposition to the nation's popular sovereignty and the inevitable march of progress, right? And the South was becoming a problem, right? And this is where we get this guy, Abraham Lincoln, right? In 1860, right, he became a presidential candidate and ran on a platform supportive of the industrial growth of the United States, right? He came out of Illinois, right? The second city, right? Chicago, right? He supported industry. And the real difference with Abraham Lincoln is he didn't sit on the fence. He hated the idea of racism and racial bigotry. And he said that if it were up to him, he would abolish enslavement. And this was controversial, right? Remember, everybody had avoided this. They don't want to talk about enslavement, never talk about enslavement because it's just going to cause a mess, right? Well, Lincoln made a determination, right, that the northern states had become so populous, right, and anti enslavement that he could win a popular vote now by taking an abolitionist stance and coming off the fence, right? That was his gamble, right? That was his plan, right? There's more people in the North. The North has become more populous, it's become more powerful. There are more people now that are anti enslavement than are pro enslavement, right? And I could play the game that all the other politicians are playing, or I can essentially decide to side with the 51%, right? As long as there's more of them, we can win the popular vote, right? And we could decide this slavery issue if we have to, because it will be the will of the nation, right? But Lincoln's open opposition to enslavement and his popularity with what was now a majority of Americans absolutely terrified the South. Like, it's coming. Uh-oh. Uh-oh. Right? We're starting to see the rising tide here. And this brings us to the crisis of 1861. Lincoln's gambit pays off, winning the 1860 election and becoming the 16th president of the United States. His election was proof, right? It was proof of the popular desire of the nation to abolish enslavement. It had no place anymore in America. More pointedly, the South's long held fear that the federal government would finally exert its power over state-owned governments was determined to be an attack on their own popular sovereignty, their regional popular. Hey, we all want enslavement. You shouldn't be able to tell us that we can't have it, right? And the South determined that the election of Lincoln was an existential threat to their economy and their way of life. Essentially, Lincoln getting elected was grounds for many of them to say, uh, start packing your bags. We got to get out of here, right? It's this is bad, right? And in 1860, we start to see the first, right? South Carolina in December of 1860 becomes one of the first Southern states to secede from the Union, right? And they began to secede one by one into 1861, right? If the United States, this is the way they saw it, if the United States wanted to be anti-slavery, if you're going to elect Abraham Lincoln, right, then the South will just leave. That we will become a different nation. That's essentially what they said, right? And they created what they called the Confederate States of America, right? Formed by 11 US states that claimed, right, that their state sovereignty had been violated by the federal government, right? And now we need to talk about this because this is something that weird enough is still kind of floated, right? People talk about the Civil War, and there's this argument that happens where you might say, hey, the Civil War was about enslavement. And somebody says, oh, it wasn't about enslavement. Oh, the South, they didn't care about enslavement, actually. What it was it was about their states' rights. It's the federal government. It wasn't honoring their states' rights. Okay. Your state's right to do what? To have slaves, right? This is stupid. This is the roundabout way that people talk about this, right? And it's because people don't want to hear themselves or paint themselves as the person who says, "Hey, we're no, we support slavery," right? And so what the South did is say, "It's not about slavery. It's about states' rights. You're not letting us do what we want to within our own state, right? Okay, what do you want to do? Have slaves, right? It's stupid. This is about slavery, right? And you can say that it's about states' rights if you want to, your state's rights to own slaves, right? And so don't be fooled by this kind of think speak, switch up, right? The South wanted slaves. That's what they wanted, right? States' rights, for sure. Yeah, they were violating states' rights. But what were the rights they were violating, right? Or that they wanted to enforce, right? The right to own slaves. And Lincoln and members of Congress openly refused to let this stand, right? Declaring, hey, there's no Confederate States of America. That's not real. These are American states in rebellion. And if it took the military to make the states return to the fold, then Lincoln was prepared to make it a war. He would not accept them leaving. That's not the way it was going to go, right? And so the Civil War begins, right? With Abraham Lincoln using the American military, right, to march down south and say, come back because we're not going to let you leave. And the southern states saying, well, we'll erect our own military to defend ourselves, essentially. And of course, two militaries, where do you get them from? Well, it's from the one military that there used to be called the United States military, right? And so the South and the North line up on either side. And the weirdest thing about this is like people are kind of watching, like, are we serious about this? Is this really going to happen, right? Nobody's going to. The Americans are gonna fight each other, right? You're like fighting your brother, right? What a joke, right? People would go out with picnics. They bring a blanket and they bring some snacks, and go, oh, I hear that the North and the South are going to have a skirmish, right? Over here. Oh, isn't that ridiculous? Let's go ahead and watch this. This war will be over in 2 minutes, right? What a joke, right? They were quite shocked when the Civil War escalated and turned into the bloodiest war in American history up until that point. And why did it become so bloody? Well, that's what we'll talk about when we talk about the Civil War in our next class. But this has walked us up to the door, right? And I think it's safe to say that that paradox that lay at the heart of the United States, this support of freedom, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, all this stuff, and enslavement, right? That this is kind of exercising the demon. And there are so many people who were contemporaries to the Civil War, right? That would say that the North's ability to fight for the abolition of enslavement is the moment when the United States truly began to deliver on their ideals, right? That this is what truly made the United States the Enlightenment idea that it was always supposed to be, right? And it came from the decision to eradicate the institution of slavery within its borders. But it was not easy, right? And it would not come without the cost of hundreds of thousands of lives, right? All right, everybody. I will see you next time for our discussion on the Civil War. I hope you have a great week. I hope you don't work too hard. I hope you get time to relax. All right, everybody. Bye.